3 seconds. It was all the margin left before the kinetic stress fractures propagated fully, turning the 30-meter section of derelict cruiser into 1,000 shards of micro-shrapnel. Keaton Vire tasted the raw metal fatigue in the air, a mix of burnt insulation and the sharp ozone smell of high-voltage burnout. His specialized recovery rig, the Scrapper 1, was currently fused to the hull by 5 active magnetic clamps trying to stabilize the prize, the severed command bridge of the carrier Valiant, lost during the initial Varn surge 18 months prior. Pressure reading on clamp Gamma 7 just spiked to 93%, a voice, flat, digital Naira Coldens, stated from the comms array. Vire, you are exceeding calculated safety tolerances by 30 points. Disengage and stabilize the rig. Keaton didn't acknowledge. Naira, back in the relative safety of the Aegis yard, had no concept of the quantum mechanics currently governing the field's decay. The debris wasn't inert, it was slowly collapsing on itself, reacting to the residual gravity waves left by the jump drive explosion that had torn the Valiant apart. If I disengage, Commander, the structural decay accelerates by half a second. We lose the core, and we lose 22 million credits in specialized equipment, Keaton said, his voice a low, gravelly rattle amplified by the helmet's internal microphone. He felt the vibration deep in his chest, a symptom of chronic stress, yes, but also the actual shuddering of the Scrapper 1's hydraulic systems fighting the gravitational shear. He focused on the data terminal welded to his gauntlet. The command core, the object of this absurdly high-risk salvage operation, was cycling through its final, corrupted boot sequence. He needed direct access before the power matrix failed permanently. That core held not just navigational records and tactical reports, but potentially the full truth of why the Valiant, a cutting-edge vessel carrying 470 souls, had been allowed to drift into the designated Varn interception corridor in the first place. Keaton wasn't supposed to be here. He was supposed to be running a flight simulator calibration on the orbital defense platform above Centauri Prime, a job designed for a freshly minted cadet, not a decorated commander who had once commanded an entire squadron. But the system had found a convenient scapegoat for the Valiant disaster, and Keaton Vire, the lone survivor of the accompanying escort wing, had been officially labeled strategically negligent. He shoved his hand into the mangled wiring where the core met the bridge's internal spine. The metal around his wrist was superheated, the thermal insulation on his glove failing instantly. He felt the sudden, searing agony across the scar tissue that crisscrossed his arm. A topography of old injuries, testament to past failures and survival, and a primal jolt of adrenaline canceled the pain. He needed the data. The pain was just noise. Vire, I am issuing a direct order. Detach now. We prioritize personnel safety over salvage assets. Naira's voice carried a thin, institutional threat. This is not about assets, Commander, Keaton murmured, isolating the main power trunk with practiced speed. This is about leverage. With a grunt that pulled taut the deep, aching muscles of his back, Keaton yanked the power trunk free, exposing the delicate optical matrix beneath. He didn't use tools. The Scrapper 1 was built for brute force, not surgical precision. He worked by feel, by the memory of engineering schematics burnt into his brain over 20 years of service. The air inside his helmet was thick with his own exertion, and the cold sweat of deep focus mixed with the pervasive smell of hot metal and industrial lubricant, the fatigue industrial complex. He inserted the flash acquisition probe into the slot. The screen on his gauntlet flashed green. Data transfer initiated. Status, Vire, Naira demanded. Core secured. Initiating remote stabilization clamps now. The recovery rig groaned, pulling against the collapsing wreckage. For 5 torturous seconds, the Scrapper 1 was caught in a tug-of-war between Keaton's controls and the physics of a rapidly decelerating stellar explosion. Then the field went quiet, the structure yielding. The rig pulled free, trailing a shimmering cloud of metallic dust, cradling the command core like a newborn in its massive claw. Keaton retracted the Scrapper-1 into the deep storage bay of the Aegis. The transition from the silent, freezing chaos of the debris field to the controlled, vibrating hangar bay was jarring. He dismounted, pulling off his helmet. The sudden absence of the com's static hum left a ringing emptiness in his ears. He stood 6 feet tall, broad across the shoulders, but the fatigue in his posture made him seem smaller. His face, etched with lines that hadn't existed before the Valiant incident, was currently slick with sweat. He walked immediately to the core, ignoring the decontamination sprayers and the 2 uniformed security officers who had watched the entire operation with professional detachment. Naira Colden met him at the transfer station. She was short, efficient, and dressed in the immaculate zero-G whites of fleet administration. She did not look at his face. She looked at the readout of his biological stress metrics. You exceeded the safety envelope by 31%, Via. That means 31% unnecessary risk to command personnel, she stated, crossing her arms. I got the core, Commander. If I followed the envelope, the core would be dust. Is the retrieval mission successful or not? Naira sighed, a low sound of controlled irritation. The retrieval is successful. Your protocol violation will be noted in your transfer profile. Now hand over the core. Technical analysis teams are ready to dissect the data. With respect, Commander Colden, Keaton held the data slab tighter, a small, heavily shielded brick that contained all the ghosts of the Valiant. Per Standing Fleet Order 9 Alpha, the initial integrity check of a black core recovered from a hostile engagement zone must be performed by the highest-ranking officer present with direct knowledge of the mission parameters. He paused. That's me. Naira's cold, green eyes narrowed. You are currently demoted, Via. Your rank is honorary until your internal investigation is concluded. I am currently the acting command representative on this station. And I am the only one who knows what information is missing, Commander. Give me 10 minutes. Keaton didn't wait for permission. He connected the data slab to a secure, independent terminal, bypassing the Aegis's main network. He smelled the Aegis, a pervasive mix of high-fidelity static and cheap coolant, the paranoia electric smell of the 24th century military life. Everything felt monitored, everything recorded. He typed rapidly, scrolling through the raw, unencrypted memory dump. Standard procedure was to look for VARN intrusion codes, weapon signature logs, or distress beacon usage. Keaton went straight to the system's primary communications log, filtering for Priority 1 transmissions before the VARN attack registered. The logs were fractured, corrupted by the explosion, but 2 distinct entries stood out, marked by a bizarre, persistent glitch in the metadata. A timestamp gap of exactly 1 standard hour, followed by an anomalous data burst coded Zenith Fallback. Keaton felt a knot form just beneath his ribs, a physical tightening that stole his breath. He knew that code. Zenith had been the Valiant's deep space operational designation. Fallback was supposed to be a pre-programmed emergency dispersal and defense measure. Yet the logs showed no dispersal. They showed only the VARN strike. He drilled down into the Zenith Fallback file. It wasn't encrypted, it was deliberately corrupted. But a few lines of plain text had survived the cascade failure, buried beneath 10,000 lines of numerical garbage. The text was a communication from High Command, not VARN, but human. It was addressed to the Valiant's captain 1 hour before the attack, and it was devastatingly short. Priority, classification, absolute. Exfiltration cancelled. Maintain position. Delay protocol. Alpha 7 initiated. Your sacrifice will ensure operational coverage for 60 days. No response required. End. Keaton stared at the screen. The command had known. They hadn't failed to detect the Varn fleet. They had explicitly ordered the Valiant to stay put, to act as a sacrificial anchor, buying the rest of the disorganized human alliance 60 days of preparation time. It wasn't negligence. It was a cold mathematical trade of 470 lives for political breathing room. This was the truth that the system had tried to bury with his career, his reputation, and his sanity. This was the weight of Zenith. "What are you looking at, Vaya?" Naira's voice was suddenly closer, laced with suspicion. Keaton hit the physical disconnect switch on the data slab, isolating the core once more. His hands were shaking slightly now, not from fatigue, but from a sudden visceral anger that had been simmering beneath 18 months of guilt. "Nothing, Commander," Keaton replied, his voice flat. He had the physical evidence of High Command's calculated betrayal secured to his wrist. He knew the cost of 470 deaths, not just strategically, but personally. His fiancée had been the lead engineer on the Valiant. Naira reached for the slab. "Give me the core, Vire, now." Keaton stepped back, tucking the slab inside the breast pocket of his heavy industrial tunic. The metal of the core felt cold and heavy against his heart. "The core is still cycling, Commander. I need to run a full diagnostic on the Aegis main server to ensure data integrity," Keaton lied, smoothly pivoting toward the hangar exit. "I will deliver the core to High Command myself. This data is too sensitive for mid-level analysis." Naira stopped, her face hardening into a mask of pure institutional disbelief. "You are refusing a direct order and attempting to steal fleet property. Vire, stop where you are. Security, detain Commander Vire." The two uniformed officers stiffened, drawing their non-lethal energy dispersal rifles. Keaton moved, not running, but walking with a slow, deliberate pace that showed he was calculating the trajectory of every threat. He knew intimately the calibration limits of the Aegis security rifles. "I have the full records of the Zenith fallback protocol," Keaton said, loud enough for the officers to hear, loud enough for Naira's face to pale instantly. "If you shoot me, Commander, these records are automatically transmitted to the 12,000 independent journalists currently tracking the Valiant investigation." It was a total fabrication. He hadn't rigged any broadcast. But the possibility, the single terrifying concept, that High Command's systemic betrayal could be instantly exposed, froze Naira Colden in place. Keaton kept walking toward the exterior hangar door, his stride heavy. He had spent 18 months healing from the psychological wounds of supposed failure. Now, armed with the cold, hard proof of systematic human corruption, his physical wounds felt trivial. The injustice was the fuel. He reached the hangar door interface. He placed his hand on the biometric scanner. A red light flashed, accompanied by a sudden, harsh voice from the station's automated intercom, overriding Naira's stunned silence. "Alert, Commander Vire. Unauthorized access detected. You are required to submit to immediate interrogation regarding General Karras's escape from Varn custody. The General is currently requesting asylum on Aegis and is demanding to speak only to you. This is an interstellar security breach." Keaton froze, his hand suspended inches from the final exit command. Karras, the alien general who had just delivered the existential truths about humanity to his own species, was now seeking refuge with the very people he condemned. And he wanted Keaton. The core in Keaton's pocket suddenly felt like a ticking kinetic bomb. He hadn't just exposed a strategic failure. He had just inherited the galaxy's most dangerous philosophical problem. The red alert indicator pulsed violently on the biometric scanner, bathing Keaton's suspended hand in an ugly, cheap crimson. The sudden, invasive voice from the intercom had done what Commander Naira Colden's threats could not. It had created perfect, immediate paralysis. Karras, the alien general, was here. Keaton slowly lowered his hand, the small movement a surrender to the gravitational pull of chaos. He listened to the shifting kinetics around him. Naira had gone completely rigid, her eyes fixed on the intercom speaker, calculating the exponential increase in her institutional liability. The two security officers, who moments before had been ready to deploy kinetic dispersal rounds, were now glancing nervously toward the main security bay, awaiting new directives. All internal procedures had just been superseded by an existential threat assessment. Code Delta 9 Gamma, Naira stated, her voice returning, clipped and dangerously calm. Deactivate containment protocol on Commander Vaya. Prioritize General Karis acquisition team. Vaya, you will report immediately to Holding Bay 6 Delta. This is no longer a matter of salvage negligence. You are still under the assumption that I am under your command, Commander. Keaton responded, his own voice sounding distant, almost detached. The physical exertion of the salvage operation was suddenly amplified tenfold by the psychological shock. His chest labored, pulling in the station air, cold, slightly metallic, and thick with the omnipresent zumbido of unshielded power relays. He could feel the fine tremor running down his arms, a residual neurological signature of 18 months of suppressed rage finally meeting an insurmountable external impossibility. Naira walked toward him, stopping precisely 2 feet away. She didn't attempt to take the core. She now looked through him, toward the political horizon. The Varn General has requested asylum, Commander. He is demanding to speak specifically to the lone survivor of the Valiant Escort Wing. The entire Alliance command structure is focused on this station. Stealing classified property is now a capital offense, but responding to a diplomatic crisis is mandatory duty. Do not mistake this temporary institutional reprieve for innocence. She was right. He had exchanged a tactical problem, Naira the disciplinary action, for a strategic catastrophe, Karis, the ideological war. The system hadn't broken. It had merely reconfigured itself around the higher threat. Where is he? Keaton asked, his eyes scanning the bay. The reinforced security teams were already cycling in through the secondary airlocks. 6 officers, all clad in full zero-G combat armor. Weapons set to lethal. They weren't taking chances with a general who had just potentially caused a systemic collapse in his own hyper-rational fleet. He is in temporary isolation at Holding Bay 6 Delta under the heaviest available shielding. The station perimeter is now under interdiction by 3 Alliance heavy cruisers Vaya. You are going nowhere. Surrender the core before you introduce a contaminant to the primary investigation. Naira extended a hand, the gesture a final, cold offering of institutional clemency. Keaton ignored her hand. He kept walking, leading the procession of armed security guards. He needed time. Time to process the devastating communication from High Command, the Valiant used as a sacrificial pawn for 60 days of political leverage, and time to understand why the alien who hated human illogicality now wanted to speak to its most chaotic consequence. He felt the hard, unforgiving surface of the core pressing against his ribs, a heavy weight that was less than a kilogram of physical mass, but contained hundreds of metric tons of moral debt. He pressed his hand against the data slab, needing the physical contact, the reminder of why he was still standing in a uniform that represented the system that had destroyed him. Elena, the sound of her laugh against the hiss of the engine cooling unit. She always insisted on listening to 21st century acoustic music while calibrating the jump drive. The memory was less than 2 seconds long, a painful, exquisite puncture into the numbness. She had believed in the Valiant. She had believed in the mission. He owed her the truth, not the systemic lie that had been manufactured to cover the political transaction. They reached the corridor leading to the high-security sector. The air here was drier, colder, constantly cycling through industrial-grade scrubbers, giving the corridor a smell of stale oxygen and old lubricant. Every few feet a wall panel flickered, unable to maintain perfect illumination. a systemic failure in an otherwise flawless structure. "You will be frisked and stripped of all non-essential equipment, Vire," Naira commanded from behind him. "The core will remain with you only until the general is secured." Keaton stopped. He turned to face Naira, the 6 armed security personnel closing ranks behind him. He removed the core from his pocket, holding it out. It was a bluff, an escalation. "I won't be separated from this data," he said, his voice dropping low, demanding absolute focus. "The Valiant disaster is the root of this current crisis. Keras, the strategic analyst who observed us, clearly sees the corruption that led to the sacrifice. If you try to take this evidence now, I guarantee I will find a way to make certain the narrative that surrounds this general's defection is entirely about High Command's treachery." Naira understood the leverage. The system could tolerate a dead soldier or a live failure, but it could never tolerate self-exposure during a critical interstellar incident. "Fine," she hissed, nodding to the security detail. "Scan him for weapons, but leave the data slab. Escort him. Double file." Keaton moved through the checkpoint. The metal detector hummed violently, registering the core's dense shielding and the residual shrapnel still embedded near his left shoulder blade from the Varn counterattack. The walk to Holding Bay 6 Delta was long and utterly silent, save for the mechanical rhythm of the guards' heavy boots and the station's relentless, high-pitched, static hum. Holding Bay 6 Delta was not designed for comfort. It was a containment unit, a temporary prison for high-value biological assets. The door was a meter-thick plate of layered carbide, sliding open with a low hydraulic sigh. Inside, the light was stark, unfiltered, and harsh. The walls were unpainted metal, glistening with a thin film of condensation, the physical manifestation of the facility's desperate attempt to regulate temperature. In the center of the room sat General Keras. The Varn general was physically unremarkable by human standards, tall, slender, with skin the color of polished slate and the distinctive tri-optic lenses that focused 3 degrees of vision simultaneously. He was sitting perfectly still on a simple metal stool, his hands folded neatly in his lap, dressed in the heavily pleated ceremonial uniform of a Varn commander, a stark, precise contrast to the chaotic, cold utility of the human bay. Naira held up a hand, stopping Keaton 5 meters from the general. "General Keras," she addressed the alien, her voice reverting to practiced diplomatic cadence. "We have processed your asylum request. This is Commander Keaton Vire." Keras did not move. He did not blink. His triple lenses focused, analyzing Keaton not as a threat or a target, but as a theorem. He scanned the lines of fatigue on Keaton's face, the slight hunch of his shoulders, the grime still clinging to his tactical tunic, and the distinct proprietary way he held the core. "I have studied the casualty reports of the Valiant," Keras stated. His voice was not the high, modulated tone recorded in the Varn fleet premise, but deeper, carrying the faint, sibilant drag of an exhausted consciousness. Keaton stood his ground, waiting for the philosophical judgment. "I told my High Command that the human species finds value in inefficiency, that your power is derived from the willingness to embrace illogical, sentimental risk," Keras continued, his voice echoing slightly in the bare chamber. "They did not believe me. They calculated that the systemic loss of 470 lives for political positioning was a flaw of governance, not a feature of survival." Keras finally shifted his gaze, locking onto the core pressed against Keaton's chest. "The Valiant was sacrificed to buy 60 days of political time, Commander Vire. A zero-sum calculation. Yet, you risked your life, violated 6 military protocols, and currently jeopardize your entire civilization's security to retrieve the evidence of that sacrifice. Why?" Keaton felt the heat rising in his throat. He looked at the alien general, the embodiment of cold, sterile logic. and saw a being struggling to reconcile his entire worldview with the chaotic, emotional evidence before him. "Injustice is an exponential variable," Keaton muttered, the words thick with 18 months of buried resentment. "It generates more energy than any fusion drive." Kara slowly inclined his head, a human gesture of recognition he must have practiced. "The system that betrayed your fiancé, the 470 souls, and your career, the very system that demands my immediate data and your immediate silence, is now forced to house us both." He paused, allowing the weight of the moment to settle. The 6 armed security officers were stone figures, waiting for the general to produce the Varn secrets they wanted, waiting for Keaton to break. "I need a pilot, Commander Vire," Kara said, bypassing all established protocol and diplomatic formality. "A pilot who understands the philosophical cost of a mission. The Varn fleet is mobilizing based on my report, my incorrect report, that human civilization is about to implode from internal strife. I was wrong. Your instability is your strength." Karis leaned slightly forward. "I came here because I need to demonstrate this strength, personally, to my own people. I need a living, undeniable example of human calculated madness. I need the one who holds the proof of the deepest betrayal and yet continues to serve the institution that betrayed him." The challenge hung heavy in the stale, humming air. Nira Colden took a step forward, ready to intervene, recognizing the alien was not delivering strategic data, but ideological contamination. "General Karis," Nira began sharply. Karis did not look at her. His trioptic lenses remained fixed on Keaton. "I escaped with vital Varn navigation data that will allow us to navigate the Varn defense lines at the Orion Gap. But the navigation drive requires 2 sets of biometric keys to initiate a primary deep jump. Mine, and the key of a suitable human alliance commander." Keaton knew instantly what Karis was offering, an escape route from the corrupt alliance system, but at the cost of immediate, direct re-engagement with the Varn war machine. "You want me to steal one of our most advanced vessels and fly you back to your enemy lines," Keaton stated, summarizing the insanity. "I want you to show my fleet the elegant futility of human existence, Commander Vire." Karis corrected him, an unsettling echo of his recorded report. "I want you to become the living paradox, the human traitor who embodies loyalty, the failure who holds the tactical key. The general has brought the map, the commander has brought the motive." Karis reached into the deep pleats of his uniform and pulled out a small, metallic data chip, clearly Varn proprietary. He slid it across the cold, wet floor. It stopped just centimeters from Keaton's boot. "This chip contains the jump coordinates and the full schematics of the Varn blockade at Orion. It also contains the exact location of the facility where the Varn are currently holding your former captain of the Valiant. He did not die in the blast, Commander Vire. He was captured." Keaton's focus narrowed instantly, obliterating the political noise, the guards, and Nira's furious silence. The system had sacrificed his fiancée and destroyed his career, but his former captain, the man who had ordered the fateful sacrifice under duress, was alive. The injustice was no longer abstract. It was specific. Keaton Vire looked down at the chip, then back at the Varn general, whose logic had just delivered the perfect, irresistible human temptation, the chance for personal, brutal resolution. He didn't hesitate. He knelt, scooping up the chip, the Varn data cold and sharp in his palm. He looked at Nira Colden, who watched the total disintegration of protocol with horror and knew he had just chosen his next war. Keaton Vire's hand closed around the Varn data chip, the small movement signaling a shift from institutional prisoner to operational asset. The cold metal bit into his palm, grounding him in the immediate raw decision. Behind him, Nira Colden finally shattered her diplomatic poise. General Keras, you are violating the terms of your asylum. Commander Vaya, drop the device and submit to immediate recontainment. Her voice was shrill, amplified by the rigid panic of a bureaucrat watching reality dissolve into high-stakes improvisation. Keaton ignored her. He stood, turning his back on the 6 armed guards and the furious commander. He looked only at Keras. We need the fastest ship capable of deep jump capacity, Keaton stated, his voice tight, the adrenaline spiking his tactical clarity. A scout vessel, minimal crew, something small enough to bypass the Alliance interdiction force without drawing 30,000 metric tons of focused aggression. Keras nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible tilt of his slate-colored head. I observed your tactical fleet, Commander. The Alliance maintains an experimental prototype in Bay 40 Alpha. Designation, Shadow Protocol. It is a lightly armed, highly agile courier vessel designed for rapid, low-signature deployment through contested zones. Perfect for your specific brand of chaos. I know the Shadow Protocol, Keaton affirmed, accessing a buried 20-year memory of experimental schematics. It has a known vulnerability. The energy conduit leading to the jump drive is exposed during spool-up. We need to divert power from the core stabilization grid to compensate, risking temporal misalignment on the exit. Temporal misalignment is preferable to immediate obliteration, Keras responded, his logic flawless. The bay is 50 meters down the main transit spoke, past the auxiliary power distribution hub. The access point is secured by 2 primary blast doors and a thermal grid. Keaton didn't need the general to draw a map. He had spent months on this station, obsessively charting every logistical weakness, every maintenance corridor, fueled by the cold paranoia of being a scapegoat in a hostile system. We go through the maintenance tunnels below the main deck. It bypasses the blast doors, but it's a tight squeeze. The tunnels are currently cycling high-voltage overflow due to the interdiction field surge. Danger accepted, Keras stated. Keaton nodded once, decisive. He turned to the guards and Nyra Colden. You have a choice, Commander Colden. You can engage 6 armed personnel against a Varn general and a fully motivated Alliance commander. A fight you will lose, but one that will guarantee both of us die before we expose High Command's treachery. Or you can temporarily fail to notice our disappearance, ensuring the valiant core is not immediately broadcast, and guaranteeing the political situation does not degrade into total interstellar collapse. Nyra's face was a mask of calculated fury. She wanted his blood, but she wanted High Command's institutional stability more. The silence hung for exactly 3 seconds. Stand down, Nyra ordered the guards, her voice barely a whisper. Allow them 5 minutes. Then initiate full station lockdown. The betrayal had been swift, clean, and entirely rational. Keaton didn't thank her. He didn't waste time on emotion. He spun and punched the emergency override on a nearby auxiliary panel. The lights in the corridor immediately dimmed to emergency yellow, and the thick, constant hum of the station's power grid intensified, filling the air with the sharp, acrid smell of ozone and hot circuitry. Let's move, General, Keaton ordered. They moved at a fast, low jog down the narrow corridor. The 6 security guards, still following Nyra's last, dangerous order, remained frozen, watching the Paradox walk away. Keaton plunged into a narrow, unlit maintenance shaft, a space barely wide enough for one human, much less the taller Varn general. The air immediately thickened with the pervasive scent of oxidized metal and decades of uncleaned industrial grease, a suffocating mix that promised pulmonary infection. The tunnel heats to 65 degrees Celsius near the power hub. Keaton grunted, scrambling through the tight channel. Keep your limbs off the central conduit. It's carrying 20,000 amps of overflow. Keras entered the tunnel with the unnatural grace of a being unaccustomed to environmental inefficiency. "Your species requires unnecessary heat for function," the general observed, his voice slightly muffled by the tight space, the statement a critique wrapped in clinical analysis. "No, General. We just build things too close together," Keaton countered, pulling himself forward by the exposed structural ribs of the tunnel. As they neared the auxiliary power distribution hub, the heat became suffocating, gluing Keaton's tunic to his sweat-slicked back. The smell of burning insulation mixed with the metallic taste of adrenaline and sheer physical exhaustion. He felt a sharp, persistent ache in his left shoulder, the residual shrapnel protesting the exertion. Keaton reached the junction box, a complex knot of high-voltage cables wrapped in failing insulation. He needed to reroute power away from the security locks leading to Bay 40 Alpha without triggering a full-sector blackout. "I need a bypass cable," Keaton gasped, wrestling with the heavy access panel. 2-meter length, heavy shielding. Karras, relying on his trioptic lenses, located a reel of heavy-duty orange fiber optic cable discarded nearby, a logistical oversight by the human maintenance crew. He passed it forward. Keaton worked quickly, his breath ragged. He sliced the main conduit insulation with a specialized laser cutter on his gauntlet, exposing the brilliant, humming copper core. The air immediately crackled with static, the sound like dry leaves crushed underfoot, filling his ears with a deafening white noise that drowned out his own heartbeat. He attached the bypass cable. As he clamped the final terminal, a surge of raw energy, a direct consequence of the Alliance heavy cruisers now attempting to lock down the station, arced violently. A bright, burning blue discharge flashed across the junction box, running down the newly laid orange cable. Keaton cried out, a guttural sound of pure, unadulterated pain. The surge hit his right hand, traveling instantly through the metallic reinforcement of his salvage glove and slamming into his nervous system. The glove's internal thermal regulation failed catastrophically, and he felt the sickening, burning sensation of muscle tissue cooking beneath his skin. He managed to sever the connection with a final, desperate jerk, pulling his arm back into the tunnel. The heat immediately diminished, replaced by a cold, radiating shock. "Report, Commander Vaya," Karras demanded, sounding less concerned than diagnostically curious. Keaton pressed his back against the scorched wall, sucking air past clenched teeth. His hand was trembling uncontrollably, the skin blackened and blistered, the smell of burnt flesh filling his helmet. Internal pressure stabilized. Keaton managed, pushing past the pain. "Security lock on Bay 40 Alpha is cycling down now. We have 90 seconds before the system flags the anomalous power draw and initiates a hard failsafe." They burst out of the maintenance shaft and into the wide concrete corridor leading to the hangar bay. The door to Bay 40 Alpha, the Shadow Protocol's berth, was already hissing open, revealing the sleek black wedge of the prototype scout vessel within. The air in the hangar was infused with the smell of hydraulic fluid and heavy lubricant, the working odor of a busy shipyard. They scrambled into the airlock, the general showing surprising agility. Keaton scanned his hand on the biometric access pad. The system barely registered the severely burned tissue, but the door cycled open anyway. Keaton didn't need comfort. He needed function. He pressed the physical pressure of the black core against his ribs, feeding the pain with the promise of vengeance. Inside the cockpit of the Shadow Protocol, the air was colder, crisper, smelling faintly of new synthetics and the sharp scent of clean-room electronics. Keaton slid into the pilot's seat. The controls were unfamiliar, designed for specialized high-speed courier jumps, not combat maneuvers. Karras took the co-pilot seat. The Varn navigation data is encrypted with a temporal lock. It will initiate when the ship's primary power is at 95% capacity, no sooner. Keaton initiated the boot sequence. The main screen flashed to life, projecting the tactical overlay of the Aegis station. The red dots indicating the interdiction force, the 3 Alliance heavy cruisers, were already tightening their net around the station's immediate space. We need 2 minutes to reach jump speed, Keaton muttered, cycling through pre-flight checks, his burned hand clumsily fighting the smooth controls. You won't have 2 minutes, Karras stated, pointing to the tactical screen. The dots representing the security forces inside the station were converging fast, following the power anomaly. They are mobilizing the internal rapid deployment unit. 2 minutes is 5 seconds too long. Keaton mashed the manual engine start. The drive hummed to life, a deep, resonating bass that shook the fragile console. The hangar door, which they had hoped would seal behind them, suddenly flashed yellow. A hard, mechanical voice blared through the cabin speakers. Warning, command override. Shadow Protocol is now under Alliance seizure. Initiating reactor shutdown. The tactical screen immediately displayed a catastrophic systems failure warning, reactor power attempting shutdown. Nyra Colden. Keaton spat, recognizing the cold logic of the betrayal. She hadn't called the guards. She had seized the ship remotely, calculating that sacrificing the Shadow Protocol was preferable to risking Karras's escape. We must stop the shutdown cycle, Karras urged, leaning over the console. Varn data release is at 95% power. We are currently at 48% and dropping. Keaton stared at the reactor control panel. The main access to the reactor override was blocked by a plasma-fused plate, a standard safety protocol. The system was designed to resist manual override during an authorized shutdown. He had 2 choices, both immediately disastrous. Option A. Spend precious seconds trying to manually override the safety protocols on the console, guaranteeing the reactor would die and they would be captured before reaching minimum jump capacity. Option B. Access the reactor physically, via the emergency maintenance shaft leading directly beneath the cockpit, and manually sever the shutdown command line. This was faster, but required exposing himself to the raw, unshielded energy of the failing reactor core. The sheer kinetic force of the reactor's magnetic containment failing would vaporize unshielded tissue, and he had already taken a massive electrical overload. He didn't need to consider it. The lives of the 470, the truth buried in the core, and the chance to confront the captain of the Valiant at the Orion Gap demanded option B. Keaton ripped off his remaining salvage glove, revealing the raw, blistered flesh of his right hand. "Get ready for takeoff, General," Keaton said, his voice strained. "I'm going below the floor plate. When the reactor hits 50%, manually shunt the power from the life support to the main jump drive capacitor. That should override the reactor's resistance. The loss of atmospheric scrubbing will induce hypoxia," Karras noted, his expression unchanged. "We are already dying, General. This just chooses the timeline," Keaton snapped. He slammed his good hand onto the manual release for the floor plate. It lifted with a groan of stressed metal, revealing the humming, terrifying reality of the vessel's exposed engineering deck. The air below was visibly distorted by the heat radiating from the reactor housing. The smell down there was thick, nauseating hot oil and superheated, corrosive metal. Keaton dropped into the narrow shaft, scrambling down the ladder. He found the main reactor control conduits, a thick bundle of cabling, pulsating with raw, controlled energy. He had seconds. The display in the cockpit above him, visible through a small aperture, showed the power dropping. 55%. 54%. Keaton located the small, heavily shielded junction box marked Command Shutdown. He took a deep breath, tasting the hot, oily air, and drove the point of his specialized field knife, a thick, 8-inch piece of reinforced carbon steel, into the junction. The moment the knife penetrated the shielding, a blinding flash of white light erupted, followed by a shockwave that slammed Keaton against the metallic wall. He felt the pure kinetic feedback travel up his arm, forcing a sharp cry of involuntary pain. He bit down hard, tasting blood, but he held the knife steady, severing the shutdown line. 49%, 48%. Keras, now! Keaton screamed, his voice strained and distorted by the confined space and the residual ringing in his ears. Above him, the general executed the maneuver perfectly. The lights inside the engineering shaft flickered violently, then dimmed to an oppressive red. Life support went silent. The atmosphere immediately began to thin, and the temperature inside the cockpit spiked. But the power surge worked. The reactor fought the shutdown command, fueled by the borrowed life support energy. Reactor power: 65%, 75%, 80%. Keaton scrambled back up into the cockpit, gasping for the thinning air. His right arm was useless, hanging limp and scorched. He slammed his left hand onto the throttle. The Shadow Protocol shuddered, pulling away from the berth. The internal security klaxons of the Aegis station were now screaming in a desperate, overwhelming symphony. "Alliance cruisers responding," Keras announced, his voice steady despite the chaos, engaging high-energy plasma containment beams. The Shadow Protocol's hull groaned under the strain of the energy field attempting to hold it. Keaton fought the controls, pushing the lightweight vessel through the narrow hangar exit. He saw the Alliance interdiction cruisers, massive, angular ships, waiting outside, their main cannon barrels cycling green, ready to fire. 94% power. Keaton wrestled the controls, dodging a nearby maintenance platform. 95% power. Varn navigation data released. A new set of coordinates flashed onto the console, complex non-Euclidean figures defining a jump pathway through the Varn-held zone. The ship was fully powered, the drive spooling up, preparing to tear a hole in space. But at that exact moment, the station's remaining defense grid achieved final lock. A massive directed kinetic harpoon, designed to anchor runaway vessels, slammed into the Shadow Protocol's aft section. The impact was not immediately destructive, but it was physically crushing, throwing Keaton against the harness. "Keaton Vire, you are impounded!" Naira Colden's voice, amplified to a punishing volume, filled the cabin. "You are pulling us apart! Surrender now!" The hull integrity alarm screamed. The kinetic harpoon was slowly dragging the ship back toward the station. They were tethered, immobile, inches from a deep jump that would shatter the vessel. "General, the ship is secured. The harpoon is magnetically bonded to the main engine block." Keaton forced out, blood dripping from his mouth, his good arm pushing desperately against the throttle. "We can't initiate jump with that mass attached." Keras, silent until now, looked at the navigation screen, which showed the rapidly approaching Varn blockade at Orion. He looked at Keaton, whose face was a mask of pain and exhaustion, yet whose eyes burned with unwavering intent. "The harpoon is designed to resist all weapon fire, Commander Vire," Keras said, calm despite the immediate death sentence. "However, I observed your species uses high concentrations of illogical material to generate maximum kinetic effect." Keras reached into his uniform, retrieving the black core of the Valiant, the single, irreplaceable piece of data Keaton had risked his life for. He bypassed the general's shocked grip and opened the core's heavily shielded access panel. He exposed the internal components, a small, complex array of optical memory chips. "There is no logical reason for the Alliance to fire on its own highly classified data," Keras stated. "You will detach the core and throw it directly into the path of the kinetic harpoon's magnetic anchor. They will be forced to shut down the harpoon to save the data." Keaton stared at the core, the physical proof of High Command's treachery, the last link to his fiancée Elena, and the price of his sanity. Throwing it out meant trusting that the corrupt Alliance system still valued its institutional secrets over eliminating him. It was a leap of blind faith into human political failure. "This is the only way to save the Shadow Protocol," Keras insisted. Keaton knew it was true. He had to sacrifice the truth to gain the leverage to pursue the greater injustice. He took the core, its cold density familiar in his left hand. He threw it, not toward the harpoon, but toward the open starboard airlock, aiming for the exact trajectory that would hover it just in front of the harpoon's magnetic tip. "Jump in 3 seconds," Keaton screamed, throttling the drive to maximum. The Alliance cruisers, sensing the imminent jump, fired. A massive plasma beam ripped past the Shadow Protocol's nose. Jump sequence initiated. Then, the second plasma blast hit, not the ship, but the highly shielded black core hovering near the harpoon. The core exploded in a silent, blinding flash of pure data, incinerated by the blast. The Alliance had chosen to destroy the evidence rather than risk the escape. Keaton felt the sickening lurch as the kinetic harpoon, still attached, ripped violently, twisting the rear engine housing. The jump field ripped open, a swirling vortex of impossible colors, but the stress fracture was too severe. The Shadow Protocol jumped, not cleanly, but violently, tearing through space with a catastrophic, uncontrolled displacement. The last thing Keaton saw before the stars dissolved into chaotic streams of light was the primary tactical screen flicker to life, displaying a single, chilling new icon. The deep jump had not taken them to the Orion Gap. The massive kinetic strain had rerouted them entirely. The screen stabilized on a new destination, an unknown quadrant of space, displaying the massive, geometric signatures of an impossibly large fleet, not Varn, but a designation he had never seen before, the Zenith Collective. And blocking their path, barely 10,000 kilometers away, was a single, immense vessel, silent and impossibly ancient, its hull radiating residual lethal energy. It was dead, but its sheer size eclipsed every ship Keaton had ever encountered. The ship's designation, stenciled in a language he did not understand, was accompanied by a single, terrifying human alliance tag, Aegis Protocol, Deep Scout 3. The ship had been missing for 30 standard years, believed destroyed at the edge of the galaxy. Keaton was trapped, crippled, and had just jumped directly into a geopolitical grave. The catastrophic displacement of the jump drive felt less like transportation and more like an instantaneous, brutal decompression. Keaton Vire slammed against the harness, the residual charge from the reactor overload sending screaming static through his nervous system. The impact of the kinetic harpoon, followed by the uncontrolled jump, had shredded the aft coupling of the Shadow Protocol. Now, the cockpit environment was a volatile mix of thinning air, freezing cold, and the smell of ozone mixing with scorched lubricant and Keaton's own dried blood. He clawed at the manual atmosphere regulator, his burned right hand utterly useless, relying on his left to stabilize the controls. The main view screen was fractured, displaying the surrounding void through spiderweb cracks. "Damage assessment, General," Keaton ground out, the hypoxia already tightening its grip. Karras, the Varn general, sat unnervingly still. He performed his analysis without visible effort, his tri-optic lenses methodically scanning the red lines, screaming across the diagnostic panel. "The structural integrity is at 18%, Karras reported, his voice flat. "The reactor is operating at 40% output, severely misaligned. The jump drive is offline and irreparable. We have 20 minutes of viable life support and 6 hours until localized gravity stress tears the vessel apart. We are, Commander Vire, a temporary containment unit." Keaton ignored the clinical death sentence. His focus was entirely on the massive derelict hanging before them, the Aegis Protocol, Deep Scout 3. It was a ghost ship of terrifying scale, its hull pocked with craters that suggested unimaginable kinetic impacts, its ancient designation barely visible beneath 3 decades of cosmic dust and micrometeoroid scarring. Beyond the derelict, the Zenith Collective fleet formed a silent, disciplined crescent of darkness. Their ships were geometric nightmares, utterly devoid of the messy, functional aesthetic of Varn or Alliance vessels. They simply existed, massive, cold and utterly still, watching the two crippled specks of life drift into their territory. "We need to board the Deep Scout 3, Keaton decided, pushing the last vestiges of engine power toward the derelict. That ship has been missing for 30 years. It knows what the Zenith Collective is. It knows what the High Command has been hiding. The Shadow Protocol cannot survive proximity to that vessel, Karras warned. Its energy signature is complex. It is radiating residual, lethal power fluctuations. "We jumped the gap," Keaton said, slamming his hand onto the airlock control. "Suit up. We are abandoning ship in 60 seconds. The transition was agonizing. The sub-zero temperatures of the void hit Keaton immediately, forcing a painful, visceral shiver that racked his exhausted body. He pulled himself along the exposed hull of the Shadow Protocol, the crippled vessel groaning beneath him like a dying animal. The air supply in his tactical suit was thin, smelling of recycled carbon dioxide and the lingering scent of ozone. Karras moved with practiced efficiency in the zero-gravity environment, using the residual magnetism of the hull plating to propel himself. He looked back once at the Zenith fleet, a vast, immovable truth, before focusing on the task. The docking port of the Deep Scout 3 was fused shut, twisted inward by some massive, long-ago internal failure. Keaton used a focused thermal lance to carve a temporary breach. The metal screamed, then yielded, releasing a sudden, foul-smelling cloud of pressurized, stagnant air into the vacuum. They tumbled through the breach and into the dark internal volume of the derelict. The atmosphere inside the Deep Scout 3 was breathable, but barely. It was cold, bone-achingly cold, a perfect environment for decay. The air smelled of 30 years of dry, undisturbed electronics, mildew, and a profound chemical scent that Keaton couldn't immediately identify. A smell of industrial sterility gone horribly wrong, like a preserved corpse in a forgotten archive. They moved through the corridors, their helmet lamps cutting through the absolute darkness. The walls were lined with obsolete wiring conduits, wrapped in insulation that crumbled to dust at a touch. This was a crypt, an Alliance memory tomb, and it was filled with the silent, institutional despair of a mission failed not by enemy action, but by deep-seated technological arrogance. The main bridge is 8 levels above, along the primary spine, Keaton murmured, relying on the ship's ancient emergency schematics burned into his memory from his cadet days. They reached the command center. The room was vast, dominated by a huge, shattered viewport that looked out upon the silent menace of the Zenith Collective. Dust lay thick on every console, a uniform blanket of gray particulate matter. Keaton moved past the pilot's chair and found the main black box terminal, not the simple data core of the Valiant, but a massive, redundant system built for deep space, long-term exploration. "General, I need power. Auxiliary power. Minimal signature," Keaton ordered, isolating the terminal's main input port. Karras, now acting as Keaton's technician, moved to the nearest power conduit, manipulating the failing circuits with a precision born of Varn technological purity. He diverted a trickle of power from the dormant vessel's thermal regulation units. The air immediately grew colder, biting deeper into Keaton's exposed flesh. The terminal hissed, blinking to life. Keaton bypassed the 3-decade-old security protocols, punching in codes that had long been rendered obsolete by software patches and system updates. The logs unfolded. They were not corrupted. They were chillingly intact. The Deep Scout 3 hadn't been lost. It had been ordered silent. Keaton scrolled rapidly past navigational data, fuel consumption metrics, and crew manifests. He stopped at a section marked Zenith Collective, Primary Biological Observation. He read, his breath freezing in the frigid air of the cabin, the truth settling on him like the weight of the derelict itself. The Zenith Collective was not a unified political entity. It was an interspecies quarantine fleet, mobilized 30 years ago to contain a catastrophic biological contamination event. And the source of that contamination was not alien, but human. Aegis Protocol, Deep Scout 3, had carried a covert payload, a 24th century attempt to weaponize an ancient, highly adaptive organism found on a remote, deep space moon. They called it the Genesis strain. The strain was designed to accelerate evolution in enemy biologies, causing rapid, localized systemic failure. But the Deep Scout 3 had failed containment. The Genesis strain had been released on a small colony world bordering the Zenith domain, transforming the local population into hyper-aggressive, rapidly evolving short-lived vectors, a wave of biological chaos. The Zenith Collective's fleet wasn't military. It was a wall of containment designed to prevent the human-made plague from spreading to the wider galaxy. They had maintained silence for 30 years, trusting the Alliance High Command had neutralized the threat, believing the Deep Scout 3 had self-destructed. Keaton's internal rage boiled, a searing counterpoint to the physical cold. The valiant, 470 lives, Elena, had not been sacrificed to buy political time. It had been sacrificed because High Command, terrified that the Zenith Collective might be breached by the Varn War, decided to test the Zenith quarantine wall using the Valiant's demise as a probe. They hadn't worried about Varn winning. They worried about the Zenith Collective turning its containment field inward, realizing the Genesis strain was still active in Alliance space. The 60 days of cover Keaton had seen in the Valiant Corps were not for political maneuvering. They were the projected time High Command needed to secure a secondary Genesis strain containment facility on a compromised border planet, before the Zenith Collective realized the leak was still active. The Zenith Collective wasn't the primary enemy. It was the ultimate consequence of human arrogance and failure, a galactic immune response to human recklessness. Keaton realized the true scale of the injustice. His grief, his demotion, the loss of his fiancée. It was all institutional noise designed to cover the 30-year lie that the Alliance had unleashed a bioweapon and then hidden behind a massive alien quarantine fleet. General Karras, Keaton said, his voice quiet, devoid of all feeling. The Varn are targeting the wrong enemy. If they break the Zenith quarantine, the Genesis strain will destabilize the entire galactic border. It doesn't discriminate between species. Karras approached the console, analyzing the data display. This changes the entire strategic equation. The human species not only embraces chaos, but actively weaponizes biological existential threat for short-term gain. We need to warn the Alliance immediately, Keaton stated, standing up. They must reinforce the Zenith quarantine, not break it by sending the Varn into it. Warning the Alliance from this position guarantees immediate location and interception by the Zenith fleet, Karras countered. They will vaporize this vessel before you transmit one coded burst. This ship is too large, its sensors too powerful. The dilemma was absolute. Keaton had lost the physical proof of High Command's treachery, the Black Core, but now held the digital proof of an impending galactic biological catastrophe. Option A. Stay silent, conserve power, and try to drift away in the dead ship, eventually finding a way back to the Alliance to deliver the data personally. Self-preservation, but the Varn fleet would likely shatter the Zenith quarantine first, unleashing the plague. Option B. Activate the Deep Scout 3's long-range comm array, a massive unshielded energy broadcast that would scream their location, but might reach the Alliance command structure in time to shift their strategic focus before the Varn arrived. Immediate death, but potential salvation for millions. Keaton looked at the shattered viewport, at the unmoving, terrifying geometry of the Zenith Collective. He thought of Nyra Colden, focused only on institutional survival. He thought of his former captain, captured by the Varn, unknowingly holding a localized piece of the puzzle. The only way to win this war was to accept the cost of the truth. "General, prepare the comm array," Keaton ordered, moving toward the primary broadcast panel, a vast console of ancient analog controls. "Maximum power. We are going to make one transmission. We will use the Deep Scout 3 designation. They will not ignore a ghost speaking the language of 30 years past." Karras didn't protest the suicidal logic. He simply initiated the required power sequence. "The main transmission antenna requires 10 minutes to cycle to maximum capacity, Commander, and the power drain will fully overload the reactor within 7 minutes. Then we have 7 minutes to broadcast the coordinates and the Genesis contamination warning," Keaton replied, his voice firm, choosing his inevitable end. He began slamming the manual controls, the heavy analog switches groaning beneath his weight. The entire ship began to vibrate, a deep, resonant rumble of ancient machinery protesting its sudden, violent awakening. The cold air crackled with rising static. 5 minutes remaining. Keaton established the link, focusing the signal through the Alliance's defunct deep space relay points. The broadcast was raw, unencrypted, designed for maximum penetration. He transmitted the coordinates of the Genesis contamination zone, followed by the explicit warning about the strain's adaptability. He transmitted the full truth of the Deep Scout 3's mission failure, naming the commanders who had ordered the cover-up. He finished with a single coded message: "Valiant was a test. The containment is failing." 3 minutes remaining. On the main tactical screen, the Zenith Collective had noticed. The massive fleet, which had been perfectly still for decades, began to move. Slowly at first, then with terrifying, controlled acceleration, their vast black shapes shifted position, focusing their geometry on the single, blinding power signature emanating from the Deep Scout 3. Keaton transmitted the final data packet, knowing the Alliance would receive it, and immediately realized the horror of their 30-year geopolitical lie. 1 minute remaining. "Karras," Keaton stated, disconnecting the console, "this is where the human paradox ends. We gave them the truth. And they will respond with predictable chaos," Karras observed. The Zenith Collective was now fully mobilized, a silent tidal wave of organized geometry. They weren't firing weapons, they were engaging a massive, coordinated defense grid, a containment field designed to incinerate any biological contaminant. The effect was immediate. The entire space surrounding the Deep Scout 3 began to shimmer, turning into a blinding, hyper-accelerated field of destructive energy. The power surge in the derelict's reactor reached its terminal point. The air in the bridge exploded in a flash of raw, unfiltered thermal energy. Keaton felt the ship's structure giving way, not slowly, but instantaneously, liquefying under the Zenith containment field. The final image burned into Keaton's retina before the ship was consumed was a tiny secondary reading on the tactical screen. The Zenith containment field had not just vaporized the Deep Scout 3. It had simultaneously registered the energy signature of the crippled Shadow Protocol, drifting nearby, a contaminant still alive. And the containment wave, vast and unstoppable, was now redirecting itself toward the escape vessel, guaranteeing total annihilation. The containment wave hit the Shadow Protocol not as a flash of plasma, but as a silent, invisible fist of kinetic thermal energy. Keaton felt the impact deep in his core, a vibration that threatened to shear his skeleton from his muscle. The ship was hurled away from the liquefied remains of the Deep Scout 3 at an impossible velocity, spinning violently until the internal stabilization systems, fueled by the last dregs of emergency power, fought back, bringing the crippled vessel to a dead, cold stop. Silence descended, absolute and crushing. The smell of burnt insulation and vaporized metal was overpowering, mixing with the sickening scent of burnt ozone. Keaton hung suspended in his harness, blind in the pitch-black cockpit. His hearing was a constant, high-pitched scream of static. a sign of neurological overload. He managed to claw at the helm, locating the physical emergency light switch with his left hand. The low-intensity red light that flooded the cabin was immediately revealing. The main console was shattered, its components strewn across the floor. The airlock door was buckled inward. And Karras. The Varn general was no longer seated in the co-pilot's chair. He was slumped against the forward bulkhead, his ceremonial slate-colored uniform ripped across the chest by debris impact. Keaton reached out, pain spiking through his functioning arm. "Karras, status report," Keaton commanded, his voice raw, barely audible over the internal ringing. Karras did not respond immediately. His tri-optic lenses were dark, shattered by the shockwave, pooling viscous blue-black biological fluid onto the metallic decking. "The broadcast was received, Commander Vire." Karras finally spoke, the sound not coming from his body, but from his emergency comm unit, a synthesized whisper. "The Alliance Command received the full data packet regarding the Genesis strain and the Zenith containment wall. Your self-sacrifice was tactically effective, strategically, an elegant futility." Keaton stared at the general's ruined face. "What is your status, Karras?" "Irrelevant," the synthesized voice stated. "My core neurological matrix is experiencing irreversible cascade failure due to blunt force trauma and localized energy contamination. I am offline. The cost of witnessing human chaos exceeded the Varn acceptable risk factor." Keaton felt a crushing sudden weight. He had just exchanged the moral debt of the Valiant for the existential debt of the Varn general, his last and only operational asset. "The Zenith Collective," Keaton rasped, searching the broken primary viewport for the terrible geometry. "They are no longer pursuing this vessel," Karras confirmed. The energy signature of the Shadow Protocol dropped below their detection threshold after the vaporization of the Deep Scout 3. "They have classified this vessel as inert space junk, contaminated beyond recovery. An administrative oversight based on their predictable efficiency." The voice flickered, then died. Karras was gone. Keaton Vire was alone, adrift in an unknown sector of space, crippled in a dying ship, surrounded by a fleet of alien quarantine vessels, knowing that his desperate sacrificial maneuver had only succeeded in proving his own capacity for self-destruction. He slumped back into the pilot's harness. The physical exhaustion was overwhelming. His burned right hand throbbed with a dull, incessant pain, radiating heat that felt alien against the growing cold of the cabin. His ribs screamed, protesting the sudden gravitational punishment. He was adrift in a cold, metallic tomb, the pervasive scent of industrial fatigue heavy in the rapidly thinning air. He closed his eyes. He had lost the core data, the physical evidence that would have given him leverage against High Command. He had lost his strategic ally. He was just a scorched body strapped into a piece of wreckage. Why? The question echoed in the internal silence. Not, how do I escape? But why did I choose this path? He had sacrificed the truth for the chance at revenge, the slim possibility of saving his former captain and confronting the institutional rot. But the captain was just one man. The core was the proof for 470 souls. He had thrown away 470 lives again, incinerating the evidence in a blaze of desperate, tactical expediency. "I am not righteous," Keaton admitted to himself, the thought cold and sterile as the failing cabin air. "I am just another variable, defined by error and vengeance. The general was right. I am chaos." This was the bottom. He had given the Alliance the terrible truth, but in doing so, he had forfeited his life, his sanity, and any chance for personal justice. He had become the sacrificial pawn he had so desperately sought to expose. Keaton opened his eyes, staring at the fragmented view of the Zenith fleet, vast, silent pyramids in the absolute blackness. They were waiting. The Zenith Collective was waiting for the contamination to fully dissipate, for the tiny, lingering power signature of the Shadow Protocol to die forever before they classified the sector as fully sanitized. His vision swept across the cracked console, settling on the secondary systems panel. His operational mind, honed by 20 years of military doctrine, refused to surrender, even when his will was bankrupt. He ran a diagnostic on the environmental controls. The atmosphere was at 60% pressure, dropping by 1% every 90 seconds. 2 hours of consciousness, then death by asphyxiation in the cold void. But the diagnostic also flagged a residual anomaly. The Shadow Protocol had an experimental tertiary cloaking system. It wasn't full stealth. It was a passive camouflage matrix designed to match the background noise of the deep void by dampening the vessel's thermal signature and distributing the light absorption coefficient. It was useless in combat, meant only for long-term courier silence. The system was running at 0.001% capacity, a single flickering micron of energy, barely enough to register on the diagnostic screen. Keaton analyzed the technical schematic stored in the flight computer's maintenance files. The passive camouflage matrix required an impossible surge of energy to initiate a full operational cycle, a burst that the damaged reactor could never provide. The matrix would immediately fail, vaporizing the internal capacitors and likely the entire ship, unless the power was fed directly, physically, by bypassing the system's safety regulators. The main power conduit for the camouflage matrix ran directly under the co-pilot's seat, Karras's now empty seat, and terminated in a junction box fused shut by the initial jump damage. Keaton pushed himself out of the harness, groaning as the pain in his ribs spiked. He moved Karras's body gently, securing it with a restraint belt, a final, useless gesture of respect for the logical enemy who had died trying to save an irrational species. He located the junction box under the seat. It was thick, layered carbide, welded shut. He only had one good hand, and the thermal lance had been lost during the transfer from the Deep Scout 3. He needed to pry it open, using sheer force and metal fatigue. Keaton found a heavy-duty hydraulic wrench lying on the floor, wrenched loose by the impact. He wedged the thick, cold metal into the seam of the junction box. He strained, pushing with his good arm, driving the power through his legs, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The pain was irrelevant now. It was just a metric of effort. The seam groaned, widening slightly. Keaton poured all his residual strength into the effort, the physical reality of the exertion overriding the pervasive smell of ozone and fear. The junction box gave way with a screech of tearing metal. Inside, the wires were a mess of exposed, frayed, high-voltage cabling. He identified the two primary power input terminals, thick, insulated cables that pulsed with residual energy. He needed to touch them together, a brief, violent arc of energy shunting the last of the reactor's output directly into the dying camouflage matrix. He didn't have tools for this. He needed a conductor. Keaton looked down at his burned right hand, the raw, blistered flesh still radiating heat. The scar tissue from past electrical injuries crisscrossed the palm. The damaged tissue offered a perverse, grotesque advantage. Reduced nerve sensitivity and a high resistance rating due to the layer of hardened, cooked flesh. This is the illogical gamble Karras spoke of. Keaton took the severed cable end in his left hand. He looked at his right, useless hand. It was an instrument of pain, failure, and now, a desperate conductor. He positioned the terminal on the metal ribbing of the junction box. He stared at the gap, the 6 inches separating the two ends, knowing the resulting surge would likely kill him instantly, sending the lethal charge through his already compromised nervous system. But if he failed, they would suffocate or be incinerated by the next Zenith sweep. He had nothing left to lose. He was already dead. This was just choosing the method. With a grunt of pure, visceral resolve, Keaton pressed his burned, damaged right hand against the exposed contact point of the second cable. The pain was instantaneous, not the searing agony of the earlier electrical shock, but a deep, overwhelming thermal burn. The smell of his own cooking flesh, immediate and sickening. The circuit closed. A blinding flash of purple energy erupted from the junction box, accompanied by a sharp, deafening crack. The entire Shadow protocol shuddered violently as the reactor, drained of its final reserves, screamed its death knell. On the fractured viewport, for one terrifying microsecond, the geometry of the Zenith Collective, the millions of metric tons of silent containment, seemed to flicker, briefly losing definition. The system diagnostic panel, running on the last micro-battery, pulsed once. Passive camouflage matrix. Initiated. Stability. 0.5 seconds. Keaton released the cable, falling back onto the floor, the paralysis setting in immediately. He could feel the blood thrumming heavily beneath his skin, his nervous system completely overloaded. The Zenith fleet, having perceived the brief, chaotic energy surge, instantly registered the anomaly. The silence was broken by the activation of thousands of synchronized energy relays. On the external tactical scan, a massive red circle began to form, centered precisely on the location of the Shadow protocol. The Zenith Collective had confirmed the presence of residual life and was preparing a final, localized annihilation wave. Keaton could not move. The only sound was the failing hiss of the cabin air. He had bought himself 1 second of camouflage and immediately drawn the full focused attention of the entire quarantine fleet. He was trapped, paralyzed, and the Zenith Collective was coming. Before we proceed, log your entry. Which country or planet are you watching from right now? The commander is tracking every active signal. The circuit closed. A blinding flash of purple energy erupted from the junction box, accompanied by a sharp, deafening crack. The entire Shadow protocol shuddered violently as the reactor, drained of its final reserves, screamed its death knell. Keaton felt the charge jump the gap, the raw, uncontrolled power tearing through the deadened tissue of his right hand and into his arm. It was not pain, but a total seismic override of his nervous system. A white-hot electrical punch that lifted his body momentarily before slamming him back onto the cold deck plates. The smell of his own burning flesh, mixed with the sharp, acidic tang of vaporized copper and ozone, creating a thick, poisonous atmosphere of industrialized fatigue and primal panic. On the fractured viewport, for 1 terrifying microsecond, the geometry of the Zenith Collective, the millions of metric tons of silent containment, seemed to flicker, briefly losing definition. The surge had worked. The passive camouflage matrix, designed for a trickle of energy, had been catastrophically overcharged, its operational efficiency spiking into the impossible red zone before stabilizing at a tenuous, unstable maximum. The system diagnostic panel, running on the last micro-battery, pulsed once. Passive camouflage matrix initiated. Stability 0.5 seconds. Keaton released the cable, falling back onto the floor, the paralysis setting in immediately. He could feel the blood thrumming heavily beneath his skin, his nervous system completely overloaded. His right arm was a useless charred stick of agony. The Zenith fleet, however, was not Vaughn. It did not rely on logic, but on systemic pre-programmed response to anomalies. The brief chaotic energy surge had been perceived. It was too much power for an inert derelict, too sudden a burst for natural decay. The massive red circle on the external tactical scan, centered precisely on the location of the Shadow protocol, began to solidify. The Zenith Collective had confirmed the presence of residual life and was preparing a final localized annihilation wave. Keaton could not move. The only sound was the failing hiss of the cabin air and the frantic, high-pitched whine of the overtaxed camouflage matrix fighting its own self-destruction. He had bought himself a single, flickering second of visibility-reducing stealth and immediately drawn the full, focused attention of the entire quarantine fleet. He was trapped, paralyzed, and the Zenith Collective was coming. His operational mind was still running, a frantic subroutine within the immobilized body. The matrix required continuous input to maintain stability. The initial surge was gone. Without power, the matrix would collapse in less than half a second, broadcasting the Shadow Protocol's location to every sensor array in the sector. Keaton's eyes tracked the emergency power indicator. Dead. The reactor was slag. The micro-battery running the diagnostic was seconds from exhaustion. He needed a power source. Now. He pushed his functioning left hand across the deck, dragging his weight inch by agonizing inch back toward Keris's body. The Varn General, dead, secured by the restraint belt. "Keris," Keaton whispered, the sound a dry, burning rattle in his throat. The General's uniform was slate-gray ceremonial wear, woven with dozens of integrated high-density power cells designed for extended field deployment and emergency life support. The Varn valued self-sufficiency. Keris's body was a battery pack. Keaton reached the General, fumbling with the restraint belt. His left hand was clumsy, driven only by a frantic, technical necessity that overrode any sense of decency. He yanked the ceremonial tunic open, exposing the armor weave beneath. He found the primary power coupler, a thick, recessed port near the General's sternum, designed for rapid field charging. He needed to connect the two primary input cables from the dead junction box directly to the dead alien General. Using the blunt hydraulic wrench, Keaton tore a section of the General's uniform free, exposing the power port. He pulled the two exposed power cables from the junction box, holding the thick insulated wires in his left hand. The camouflage matrix screamed a warning. Stability dropping, 0.2 seconds. Keaton pressed the exposed copper ends of the cables against the Varn power port. Nothing. The Varn system required a handshake, a coded sequence to initiate power transfer. It was a fail-safe against exactly this kind of chaotic, irrational maneuver. He smashed his head, helmetless, against the shattered console in frustration, a dull, physical impact that briefly sharpened his focus. Then, the memory surfaced, a dusty, 3-cycle-old technical bulletin regarding Varn battlefield logistics. Their power conduits were designed to bypass the coded handshake under extreme thermal stress, a safety measure to ensure internal power flowed during high-intensity atmospheric re-entry. Keaton looked at his right hand, the charred, useless conductor that had just generated enough heat to bypass the Varn system. He grabbed the two cables in his left hand, positioning the copper ends against the Varn power port. Then, with a scream that tore his throat, he pressed his burned right hand, his useless, heat-radiating conductor, hard against the metal plate covering the port. The thermal conductivity, combined with the extreme heat emanating from his wounded hand, registered as atmospheric re-entry. The Varn system bypassed the handshake. The lights on Keris's uniform flickered, then glowed bright emerald green. Power surged from the dead General into the dying camouflage matrix. Stability restored. Current load, 120%. The Shadow Protocol went truly silent, its thermal signature suppressed to absolute zero. The Zenith fleet, thousands of containment vessels surrounding them, instantly lost the vessel on its sensors. The massive red circle, the annihilation target, flickered, then dissolved. The Zenith Collective, operating on programmed efficiency, immediately cancelled the localized purge and returned to sector quarantine posture. The anomaly was gone. The target was inert. Keaton lay gasping, The general's body now fused to the ship's power grid by the impossible circuit of his own scorched flesh. He had neutralized the immediate threat using pure, agonizingly painful human improvisation. He had become the epitome of the irrational variable Karras had described. The cabin was silent again, save for the low, hypnotic whine of the stable camouflage matrix. Keaton Vire lay in the cold, thick air, his body a ruin but his mind calculating. They were safe from the zenith, for now. He dragged himself back to the pilot's chair, pulling his broken body into the harness. He ran a diagnostic. Propulsion, 0. Weapons, 0. Comms, external transmitter fused. Life support, 60% pressure holding steady, fueled by the borrowed Varn power. They were an inert ghost in the void, undetectable, but incapable of movement. He looked at Karras, now merely a sophisticated power cell, the logical, ordered Varn general reduced to fuel for chaotic human survival. Keaton felt a profound emptiness. He had won the tactical exchange, but the cost was absolute. He had no way to move, no way to signal, and no way to prove High Command's treachery. The core data was burned up in the first surge. The truth was now entirely internal, trapped in the mind of a compromised man aboard a crippled ghost ship. This was the victory. Isolation, paralysis, and the knowledge that he had survived merely to become a long-term liability. A weak, intermittent signal suddenly flickered across the ruined comms panel. It wasn't the Zenith. It was a human alliance frequency, distorted by the deep void and the Shadow Protocol's own heavy camouflage. Keaton forced his good hand to the frequency tuner, boosting the signal manually. A voice, clean, institutional, yet overlaid with severe static, penetrated the cabin's silence. It was Nyra Colden. Shadow Protocol. Repeat. Shadow Protocol. If you are receiving this signal, do not respond. You are considered inert and contaminated. High Command is aware of the full Genesis strain data transmission. Protocol 11 Delta is in effect. We cannot retrieve you. The quarantine wall is absolute. You fulfilled your mission, Vire. You bought us the time. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the synthesized white noise of deep space. Keaton had achieved his vengeance, not by exposing the system, but by feeding it, becoming the sacrificial delay they had always intended the Valiant to be. The Alliance had accepted the truth, classified it, and immediately abandoned the deliverer of that truth. Then the static cleared momentarily, and Nyra's voice returned, carrying a new, chilling clarity. One final note, Commander Vire. General Karras's asylum request was noted, but administratively deferred. His capture would provide a necessary psychological victory for the Alliance. Therefore, a secondary signal has been transmitted to the Zenith containment fleet, alerting them to a new power anomaly signature. A brief, localized fluctuation consistent with Varn biological life support systems in the vicinity of the Shadow Protocol. Keaton stared, paralyzed, at the General's emerald-glowing power port. We have supplied the Zenith Collective with the precise metrics of the Varn life signature, Commander. They will not destroy the vessel. They will pursue the capture of the Varn General for interrogation. This is paramount to maintaining the public narrative of controlled conflict. Your vessel provides necessary cover. We require you to remain inert for an indefinite duration. You are now the anchor, Vire. You are the Zenith Wall. The transmission cut out entirely. The voice was gone. Keaton Vire was not just abandoned. He was a deliberately deployed piece of bait, a strategically vital derelict, with the dead alien general functioning as the beacon. He looked through the viewport. The vast, silent geometry of the Zenith fleet, which had gone still, now stirred. Thousands of vessels shifted, not preparing for an annihilation wave, but adjusting their vectors. They were coming for the Varn General, drawn by the signal of life Naira Colden had supplied. Keaton was trapped between two implacable enemies: the logical, destructive efficiency of the Zenith and the cold, calculated corruption of the human high command. He had survived the tactical exchange only to find himself in the center of the strategic disaster. He pushed his paralyzed body to the limits of its pain threshold, desperate to reach the one remaining viable system on the helm, the auxiliary distress beacon. He couldn't signal the Alliance; they would only confirm his location to the Zenith. He needed to signal something else, something chaotic, something desperate and uniquely human. Keaton's trembling left index finger finally touched the switch marked Auxiliary Beacon. Broadcast mode. Uncensored. Long range. He held the button down, initiating a repeating, non-coded broadcast directed away from the Zenith fleet and toward the densely populated, politically fractured core worlds of the Human Alliance. The signal was simple, consisting of only 6 words, repeating into the void. A final, despairing gesture of defiance against both alien efficiency and human political rot. Valiant, Protocol 11 Delta. We were sacrificed. Keaton released the switch, sinking into the harness. He had broken the silence. He had traded his life for one final, public accusation. He closed his eyes, awaiting the calculated response of the Zenith Collective. He was the chaotic variable, and his noise was about to bring the entire system down on his head. The transmission ceased, not with a flare of static, but with a sudden, suffocating vacuum. The digitized institutional threat of Naira Colden vanished, replaced by the profound, absolute silence of the deep void. Keaton Vire hung in the pilot's harness, immobilized not by the ship's restraints, but by the physical failure of his own body. The white-hot electrical residue had retreated, leaving behind a cold, deep throbbing in his right arm. He registered the pain as data. Systemic damage, probable nerve necrosis but survivable in the short term, provided the environment remained stable. The Shadow Protocol had become what it was always designed to be, a highly efficient ghost. The Zenith fleet was drawing closer, but with strategic deliberation, not tactical urgency. They had accepted the information supplied by High Command and were now vectoring to extract the Varn General, operating under the assumption that the derelict vessel was merely an inert delivery system. Keaton watched the 3 distant massive containment cruisers change formation, their vast, silent geometries moving with the precision of clockwork mechanisms. They were closing the trap, using human treachery as their guide. He had perhaps 15 minutes before the Zenith boarding parties would pierce the hull. He forced his left hand to the console, testing the limits of his remaining strength. The auxiliary beacon, his final, desperate broadcast, was still cycling through its loop, burning a minimal charge of the Varn General's borrowed energy. Valiant, Protocol 11 Delta. We were sacrificed. He terminated the broadcast. The message was sent. It was an anonymous spark of outrage tossed into the densely packed political environment of the core worlds. It would be buried by institutional noise, labeled as Varn psychological warfare, or simply ignored as the ravings of a lost, desperate crew. But the seed of doubt, the knowledge of sacrifice, was out. The price of that defiance was his immediate, unromantic demise. Keaton unbuckled the harness, his movements slow and painful, every fraction of an inch an act of will against gravity and biological exhaustion. He moved back to Karis's body, still fused to the junction box by the scorched skin of Keaton's right hand. The emerald glow of the Varn power cell was the only light source in the cabin now. He gently pulled his hand free. The adhesive quality of the burnt tissue separating from the cold metal produced a sickening, tearing sound. Karis's body instantly went dark. The flow of power stopped. The low whine of the camouflage matrix immediately began to decrease in pitch, a mournful sound of impending collapse. Keaton now had only minutes, perhaps seconds, before the zenith sensors detected the thermal bloom of the dying vessel. He secured the general's body back into the restraints, closing the ceremonial tunic. Karis was dead. He had delivered his terrible truth, the revelation that humanity, when faced with existential threat, would always prioritize cynical, short-term political leverage over the philosophical integrity of survival. He deserved to be returned to the void, not become a perpetual propaganda tool for either side. Keaton returned to the helm. He had no plan for escape. The ship was dead weight. He had traded immediate oblivion for strategic delay, and now the delay was over. He reached into the internal pocket of his heavy industrial tunic. 18 months ago, he had felt the cold, dense weight of the Valiant Command Core, the heavily shielded brick that contained the truth of Protocol Alpha 7. He had retrieved that core through agonizing effort, driven by the smell of burnt insulation and the raw metal fatigue of the derelict. He needed that leverage. Now, all the data was gone, vaporized in the tactical surge. The truth was no longer physical, it was scar tissue and memory. He looked at his hands. The left hand, calloused and functional, still capable of technical work. The right, black, fused, permanently marked by the irrational act of powering a ghost ship with his own flesh. The scars were a detailed topography of every decision, every sacrifice, every instance of political rot he had fought against. He closed his eyes. The omnipresent, electric paranoia smell of the 24th century military life, high-fidelity static and cheap coolant, was fading. All that remained was the sterile chill of the deep void and the pervasive metallic tang of his own exhaustion. Keaton pulled the harness tight around his chest. He was officially a runaway criminal, a tactical ghost, and a strategic anchor. He would drift here, an anonymous sentinel guarding a political secret, until the Zenith found him, or until the Human Alliance deemed his position inconvenient and decided to eliminate the anomaly. Either way, the campaign was over. He thought of the 4,700 souls of the Valiant, sacrificed for 60 days of political breathing room. He had just ensured the Alliance had bought more time, confirming the cynical effectiveness of human betrayal. The system had won. The silence grew heavy, absorbing all other noise. The camouflage matrix was failing completely now, a flicker of light on the dying diagnostic panel. He leaned his head back against the cold headrest, feeling the subtle, constant vibration of chronic stress that had plagued him since the Valiant incident. It wasn't the ship vibrating anymore. It was his own exhausted nervous system. The fatigue industrial complex had claimed its final asset. He waited for the sound of the hull breach, for the cold, efficient touch of the Zenith containment field. He inhaled deeply, tasting the sharp ozone of high-voltage burnout once more, the persistent scent of failure and survival. This was not a glorious end. It was logistical deferral. The ultimate cost of the truth was simply being the one left holding it. He opened his eyes, staring out at the infinite, indifferent void, the geometry of the Zenith ships looming closer, silent, inevitable. The system always finds a way to salvage its mistakes, by eliminating the inconvenient witnesses. His fate was sealed, not by an enemy cannon, but by an administrative decree. The retrieval mission was finally complete. The smell of burnt insulation remained, a quiet testimony to human error and strategic leverage long after the air went cold. This story is now part of the archive. Subscribe to help preserve future transmissions and share this episode with someone who still believes in science fiction.